Good afternoon. I'm Richard Greenwald, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. And on behalf of Fairfield University, the Fairfield Museum of Art, and the college, I welcome you to today's events to commemorate, collectively mourn, and remember 9/11. 20 years is a long time. For many of our students, 9/11 is a historical event. For those who are older like me, it's burned into our core. This afternoon, we have the opportunity to be with the photographer Joe Mcnally and his portraits of heroes. That's a term that is sadly used too often today with irony. Those photographed were heroes. 20 years ago, I lost a dear childhood friend, neighbor, and cousin who was a New York City fireman. A few months after his funeral, I wrote about the events. I reflected on the hundreds of firemen and women who attended his funeral from far and away places. I asked one of them why they were there, traveling so far. And I'll never forget what he told me. They were there so that the New York Fire Department folks could be at the pit. And that too was heroic. These photographs of the faces of ordinary people reveals a shared humanity that we need to look at, contemplate, and reflect on. So again, on behalf of Fairfield University, welcome to the discussion.
Thank you, Dean Greenwald, for those opening remarks. I'm Michelle DiMarzo, the Curator of Education and Academic Engagement at the Fairfield University Art Museum, and it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce this afternoon's speaker, photographer Joe Mcnally, who will be talking about his Faces of Ground Zero project. Joe is an internationally acclaimed, award-winning photographer whose prolific career includes assignments in nearly 70 countries. He has shot numerous cover stories and features for the National Geographic, Life, and Sports Illustrated. He's equally comfortable climbing buildings or lighting a telescope as he is capturing quiet, sensitive subject matter in medical surroundings. Joe won the first Alfred Eisenstadt Award for Journalistic Impact for a life coverage titled The Panorama of War. He's been honored by numerous organizations, including by Communication Arts, Graphis, American Photo, and the World Press Photo Foundation. His work also bridges the world between photojournalism and advertising, with clients ranging from FedEx, Nikon, and General Electric to Adidas and ESPN. Joe Mcnally is a proud Nikon ambassador and also a recent member to the Capture One ambassador team. During Joe's talk, please feel free to use the quick live chat function to ask questions, as he has generously said he is willing to answer questions both during his remarks as well as at the end. And now please join me in welcoming Joe Mcnally.
Thank you, Michelle. Appreciate it. And thank you, Dean. And thank you for the invite, all staff and members of Fairfield University and anyone who's tuning in. Appreciate the opportunity and honored by the invitation. As the Dean was indicating, it is an amazing and difficult thing to get your head around, the fact that 20 years have now gone by since that day, that morning, that bright blue sky morning, that we were of a certain age, remember. So I'm gonna move quickly through a number of images just to kind of give you a sort of a flavor and a history of where I grew up photographically, which was New York City. I moved into New York City in 1976 and started working at the New York Daily News as a copy boy, and eventually just moved on into photographic ranks for newspapers and magazines. So I have a lot of sort of visual backlog of New York City, and the city has always been a source of inspiration to me. When I moved into the city in 1976, the trade centers were relatively new, and they were the talk of the town. The city itself was in a desperate condition economically, but the trade centers became this visual symbol that photographers, everyone really gravitated towards, but certainly photographers, any number of scenes that I can recall, I included the trade centers because they gave you an instantaneous sense of beauty and location. And of course, then they were gone. This I made quite a number of years ago in the aftermath of Ground Zero with that missing piece of the skyline. And I have to tell you, from a personal point of view, I fly a lot. And when I fly back in over New York City and I look down at Manhattan, I still miss them. My own personal history with the towers goes back to 1978 when I climbed the antenna on the North Tower with a maintenance crew. And we were at or very near the top of the antenna. This is old school climbing. We just had safety belts, no safety harnesses or anything like that. And the gentleman there, his first name is Johnny. I do not remember his last name, but I do remember his nickname. He was called the Spider-Man for good reason. The trade centers became iconic. As I say, you put them in the back of a photograph, you knew instantaneously where you were. I developed a number of relationships with tall buildings in Manhattan. The Empire State Building, as an American Olympic skier, improbably placed on the edge of the Empire State Building, looking south, obviously, with the trade centers in the distance. And then, of course, cataclysmically, virtually instantaneously, in many, many ways. I mean, the trade centers took 10 years to build and 2 hours to come down. And they disappeared from the skyline forever. So why am I showing you a picture of a ballerina? I had an opportunity to photograph, because it was such an unusual instrument, the world's only giant Polaroid camera. And I have a long history of photographing dance. So Jenny Ringer of the New York City Ballet volunteered to help me, bless her. She came down to the giant Polaroid studio and posed for all of these in a single day. The positive print, if you will, that issues forth from this camera, which is the size of a one-car garage, comes out in the dimensions of 40 inches by 80 inches. When framed, they're about 4 feet by 9 feet, and the frames themselves weigh about 300 pounds. So there's Jenny on point, and I found myself over the course of this day working with this camera to do the story about the camera. I had a sort of an affinity for it. The people who ran the camera told me that oftentimes people would come in and rent the studio for an entire day, and they would only produce 2 or 3 prints. I knocked out 8 images of Jenny in one day, and I gave her one of them, which she in turn gave to her parents. I told her, I said, I hope your parents have a big house, because this requires a lot of wall space. But I hark back to that camera after 9/11. As many people did, I stewed in the aftermath of 9/11, emotionally distraught, wondering what to do. What could a role be that I could fulfill, that I could make some sort of contribution? I'm not a cop, I'm not a firefighter, I'm not EMS, I'm a photographer. There were plenty of photographers who went to the pit and recorded the disaster and the physical effects of the disaster in astounding fashion. I would have just been another. So I tried to think of what else I could do that might be in a slightly different vein. And I hark back to this camera. I had a long history with Time Warner magazines. I went to the top of Time Warner administration and I asked them for money to fund this project, to fund the camera. It is an expensive camera to work. Every single sheet, every picture you make at that point in time was $300. So you can do the math. It can add up quite quickly. Time Warner stepped forward immediately and supported the project. People were looking for something to do. People were looking for a way to tell their story. And so this camera, being an old combination of old school photographic principles and modern Polaroid technology, seemed to give people that bridge, that emotional bridge, that they could come to the camera and literally stand for their portrait, which is what you used to do in the old days. The camera required a dark room. You had to black the entire room out. The lens had no shutter. So you'd actually physically pull a cap off the lens and then connect the camera to a massive strobe system. The room would go up in light and a full-size, life-size portrait of your subject would be recorded. The first person to step in front of the camera was then firefighter with Engine 33, John Baldessari. Ladder 9 Engine 33 had lost, I believe, 12 men on that day. And they were very close to the Polaroid studio. And such was the emotionality of the time that I wanted them to come to the studio, and all I had to show them was a rolled up Polaroid of a ballerina, which I rolled out on the firehouse floor and tried to explain to them what I was trying to do, that proceeds would go to charity. If they would come down to the studio, I could help tell their story. And the next thing you know, 2 hours later, the rap of a Halligan came on the studio door, and they had rolled the trucks around, and the firefighters came in. I've stayed with this story. That's John 10 years later as a lieutenant, still at Engine 33. John's now retired. But what I'm about to show you is a combination of, or a series of images that are combination slides, if you will, that show the events of 9/11, the immediate aftermath. All the original Polaroids were shot within a month of 9/11. And then 10 years later, Chief Jay Jonas. He was a member of the, I guess you could say they were famous. I mean, to me, the story is astounding, which is why it is so durable and we still recount it today. The miracle of Ladder 6. 6 firefighters came upon Josephine Harris. The North Tower had already come down. The next tower to go was obviously the one they were in, and they were making their way down, and they came upon Josephine, who was moving slowly. These 6 firefighters stayed with Josephine. There's Sal D'Agostino, one of the 6, even though they thought that her pace of descent was going to kill them. But firefighters being firefighters, they refused to leave her. They got to the 4th floor stairwell and Josephine gave up. She said, "I cannot go on. You guys go ahead." They refused to leave her. And the building came down all around them. And that 4th floor stairwell was the only area of that entire structure that in the near area of that structure that stayed intact. By staying with Josephine, they saved themselves. The building turned, the entire stairwell turned 360 degrees, and they all lived. Years later, just as a piece of the emotional puzzle that you have to try to understand about 9/11, Josephine passed away. She was reclusive and ill and had virtually no money left when she passed away. Her body was in the morgue, awaiting a burial she could not afford. News of her death came to Ladder 6, and Chief Jonas started working the phones. The Greenwich Village Funeral Home donated their services. And Ladder 6 once again assembled. And Ladder 6 carried Josephine one last time to her final resting place. The emotionality of 9/11 is something that will never leave anyone who has participated or witnessed the events of that day. Mike Meldrum was one of the 6. And there's Josephine. Ladder 6 dubbed her their guardian angel. Father Jordan stepped up after Father Michael was killed in the wreckage. His signature is his sneakers. And so there he is in his giant Polaroid with his sneakers. And then 10 years later, riding the subways as he does, pursuing his ministry. Archbishop Demetrios, that candelabra he's holding 10 years later is the only, I guess you could call it, not a relic, but an artifact that they were able to rescue from St. Nicholas. That candelabra was on the altar at St. Nicholas. The towers came down and crushed the entire church. Mike Wernick. Mike had probably closer to what they might refer to as the 1,000-yard stare when he came to the studio. I never thought I would see Mike again. He was virtually wordless. He posed for his Polaroid, and he left the studio. He had had a horrific experience on 9/11, but survived. Mike and I have become friends over the years. In fact, we spoke on 9/11 day this past year. His wife, Nuri, kept calling me in the aftermath of making the Polaroid because Mike refused to talk about the events of that day, and she kept saying to me, "Please have your writer call him again. I think he's ready to talk." And he finally told his story of that day, and he is in the book called Faces of Ground Zero. And he's alive again, really, because of Nuri's love and the fact that she nurtured him back to health. And I've stayed with Mike and Nuri, and I photographed them throughout the years. And at the 10th anniversary, Nuri came to me and she had made a small book of pictures, and she gave them to me because every year on 9/11 morning, I would go back to engine 33, ladder 9, and I would just simply stand with the firefighters. They were the first ones to come to the camera, so I would go back to that particular firehouse, and Nuri would make a picture of Mike and I, and she gave me this book, and she said, here's the thing, the pictures helped him heal. And that's the power of photography, and that's why there's a reverberation that occurs after you make a set of pictures, any set of pictures really, family, personal, but in this instance, the time that these photographs were made was so emotional that to this day, I still remain close to many of the people who came in front of that camera. Louis Caccioli. Louis, of course, I always refer to him as a firefighting Robert De Niro. He saved many people that day, and he became the cover of the book. The Faces of Ground Zero became a show that toured 6 cities and then returned to New York, and also the book, etc., was sold. Proceeds contributed to the donation of nearly $2 million in the aftermath of 9/11 for the relief of downtown public education. Louis and I still talk to this day. About a year after 9/11, the two of us are out there on the Staten Island ferry. And this is up at Engine 47, his old house. Made a portrait of him about a year after 9/11. And then on the Brooklyn Bridge, 10 years later. So photographs make an emotional connection. As a photographer, you can feel it very powerfully at the camera. It's not simply an act of pressing a shutter and having, pixels record light. There's an emotional contract that gets established when you make a photograph of someone. You're essentially telling them, I will take care of you. I will do my best at the camera, and in the aftermath, I'll be the good shepherd of your photographs. Because they give you a tremendous gift. Subjects of photographs come in front of your camera, and that is a gift they give to you, and it's up to you as the photographer to cherish that gift and care for it. Larry Olivetti, ESU. When Larry came to the giant Polaroid studio, he was very angry. Numerous cops had died, but many more firefighters had died, and he felt that there was not enough attention being paid to the police force. In the years after that, I stayed in touch with him. He's retired now, wonderful man, and he was the chauffeur for ESU-1, which saw a tremendous amount of action in the aftermath of 9/11. Harry Davis, Squad 18. Harry got up in front of the Polaroid camera. I didn't say a single word to Harry. I didn't ask him to do anything. He closed his eyes and cradled his axe like a baby. Oops. All manner of endeavor was represented down at the pit or in the aftermath of the destruction. These gentlemen had the tragic and emotional task of sifting through the rubble, seeing if they could find anything to identify those lost. A ring, perhaps, something that survived the intense heat of the blazes that consumed the building. Janusz Demscher, a window washer. That squeegee blade is in the Smithsonian. He was trapped in an elevator with 4 other people. They pried the doors open, and they used the squeegee blade to carve out a big enough hole in the sheetrock so that they could all be saved. The Sanitation Department, if you can imagine the massive role they played. Howard Hawkins, he was an iron worker. The iron workers plunged in at 9/11. They had no training the way the police and the firefighters do in terms of safety, but they took torches and pry bars and they went after the rubble in an astonishing fashion. Stuyvesant High School kids, okay, their lives completely shut down. Stuyvesant High and all of Lower Manhattan were closed. 10 years later, in college. Keith Johnson, okay, down to ladder 6, the Chinatown Dragon Fighters, okay. Keith and I are friends to this day. Keith is one of those amazing New Yorkers. Keith could have a conversation with anyone or anything just about. Voluble. He's the chauffeur for one of the tiller trucks. The tiller trucks require two people to drive them because they're so long. And as Keith has told me many times, he goes, Joe, if you're driving that truck and you look in your rearview mirror and you see the rear end of the truck in another lane, that's a problem. And Keith is very close to his daughters. That's down in Chinatown, his daughter on his shoulders. And, you know, it's something that just keeps going. His daughters called my wife and I up, and we became the secret guests to his 60th birthday party. And we became the photo documentaries for the surprise party that his family staged for him. Juana Lomi risked greatly that day. She's a paramedic. Later, on the streets, 10 years later, still on the streets. Katrina Marino and her kids, Kristen and Tyler. Katrina lost her husband, Kenny. He was on the truck, Rescue 1. And that shield from the helmet is all she has of Kenny. But after the kids posed with their mom for this picture, their home flooded with Dorothy dolls from The Wizard of Oz. And 10 years later, okay, there's Tyler again, or Kristen, excuse me, still with the Judy doll. Okay, Mike Morrissey and Billy Ryan. And 10 years later, outside the firehouse. Mike is especially poignant because that cross he holds is made out of WTC steel, and it commemorates the cousin he lost on 9/11. Michael Lamonico. Michael came to the camera. He was the chef at Windows on the World, which lost 83 people. He's alive because of those glasses. That morning, he thought, you know, my glasses are really bothering me. I'm going to go get them fixed. He went into the subterranean mall, and he said he was in the chair having his glasses fixed, and he felt a rumble. No one from his restaurant got out alive. If you were above the planes on that day, it was a death sentence. Michael heroically has taken his business partners, and they made a foundation which is ongoing and self-funding, and every single child from the restaurant staff he lost has been able to go to college on the funding that that foundation has provided. Dr. Daher, he was on duty in the emergency room at Downtown Hospital, which became flooded not only with patients, but also ash from the canyons of Lower Manhattan just funneled the ash straight down the streets. And where you see those EMS trucks, that entire area was filled with gurneys, with people with varying degrees of injury, all of whom, including his staff, literally covered in ash. The Foley family. Joanne and I just spoke the other day. She lost her brother Tommy. That's Tommy's ceremonial helmet she's holding and his cowboy hat. He was a rodeo guy, Tommy Foley. And he died on the first truck of Rescue 3. All of those on Rescue 3 perished. And 10 years later at the Foley family home in upstate New York, Danny, Tommy's brother, came to the camera 2 days after he found his brother's body. And 10 years later, I photographed him. That's Tommy's mass card. And every fire Danny went into, he had Tommy's mass card in the band of his helmet. Danny is now gone from 9/11 related injuries and cancers. So Joanna's lost both her brothers to the events of 9/11. Jason Cascone. Jason was a probationary firefighter on 9/11 day. If you can imagine your first day of work being put on a bus and given last rites. He went to the pit and started working, and he became the youngest lieutenant in the history of FDNY and has gone on to become a captain and now a chief. Joe Hodges. Joe and I are, I don't know, we're buds. What can I say? Just an incredibly decent man. A lot of firefighters did opt to retire after 9/11. Joe opted not to. As he said in the book, he said, now is not the time for the older guys to go. We lost 343 firefighters. The older guys have to stay around and show the young guys the way. It's good to be friends with FDNY. The show staged again 10 years later. And I ran around to get funding, and I was short funding. And the building that staged the show, the Time Warner Center, demanded that licensed art handlers, licensed bonded art handlers were the only ones who could bring the pieces in. I called Louis. I said, Louis, I got to get these pictures in there, and I can't afford it. Louis started making calls, and I went back to the building and I said, we're not going to have licensed bonded art handlers. FDOI is going to bring in the pictures. And about 60 firefighters showed up that night and worked from 11 o'clock at night till 4 the next morning to set up the show. All I gave them were snacks and Gatorade. And they took it down for free. They pitch in. They work with you. Keith especially has been looking, I try to help, and at one point I was trying to lift a frame and he just strong-armed me out of the way. And he goes, Joe, stay away from pictures. You're a freelance photographer. We're firefighters. We got lifetime disability. What if you throw your back out trying to lift this? He goes, Joe, nobody cares about you. And that was kind of the history, that you develop by being a photographer or relating to people on this level for this long, that relationships continue. And 10 years later, coming full circle, there's Jenny down at Engine 33. I asked her to come back. I said, look, the guys would love it if you came back. All they ever saw was your photograph, and they would love it if you would come to the firehouse and pose with them. And so a bunch of them assembled. Jenny came down and went on point 10 years after the fact at Engine 33 on Great Jones Street. If anyone is interested in pursuing any information about this, as you go forward, you can just Google Faces of Ground Zero. There's a hot link and there's videos, and people will tell more of their stories than I possibly can in this half hour that we have together here. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to try to answer.
Thank you so much, Joe, for walking us through that. That was really incredible to see, as you say, the relationships that you built between these individuals when you photographed them, and then years later. I want to leave space for the folks who are in the room with you in case they may have questions, because I certainly have a few of my own.
Anybody? Sure, I can answer a question here in the room. The physical reality of these pictures, and where are they now, and what role will they possibly play in the future? I can say this, it was a long road, or it's been a long road. Been a very positive road since 9/11 in terms of the relationships, as I've described. But the physicality of the photographs is daunting. In the aftermath of 9/11, I all of a sudden became the owner of 24,000 pounds of photography. 12 crates, each weighing about 2,000 pounds, in museum quality storage. It was like having another mortgage for many years. I kept shouldering that and going forward and seeking support. I have a wonderful relationship with the 9/11 Museum. Jan Ramirez, who's a director of curations down there, is just a resolute fan of the project. She's been an advocate for it for many years. And she spearheaded a drive where the museum agreed ultimately to take over possession and pay for the storage. So they're up now in a museum quality storage facility near Albany, New York. And we've entered into a long-term arrangement where the museum acquires a piece every year, and I donate a piece every year. They have not been seen now for 10 years. It's daunting, as I say. They're large. It costs money to move them and put them on the floor of the 9/11 Museum. The pandemic, of course, has not helped. The 9/11 Museum is strapped for funds and visitors. So we wait, and hopefully these pieces will once again be displayed and people once again gather, as they did years ago when the show was touring, and re-meet these people. The thing about using the giant Polaroid camera was it's a different medium. It's virtually grainless. So when you have a life-size giant Polaroid of a person in front of you, it is very akin to actually meeting that person. And when you have that kind of life-size experience coupled with their words, which are on placards on the frame, it's very, very powerful in terms of relating the reality of that terrible, terrible day 20 years ago.
Thank you. And you just answered a question that I had, Joe, which was, about the impact of it being that particular type of camera, like knowing that it is grainless. I mean, I noticed the quality of those images was incredibly crisp. So that's an incredibly additional detail. And since you mentioned the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, I'll just share with anyone who is watching that we will actually be welcoming the chief conservator of the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, Lisa Conte, at 5 p.m. this afternoon as the second in the College of Arts and Sciences co-sponsored series of events. We did have a couple of questions that came in on the Quick Live, and I'd encourage folks, if they have others, to share them. Kim asked if you took any pictures of 9/11 survivors other than the firefighters and the chef of the restaurant, and was wondering where she might look to see others. So you might be able to talk a little bit more about your website, perhaps.
Sure. Go to this website. There is a selection. All told, 272 people came in front of the giant Polaroid camera. They came to the camera from all walks of life. Obviously, firefighters became a huge piece of the overall project because of their incredible role and the incredible tragedy of loss that they had within the firefighting corps. But also we had EMS, we had police officers, we had the canine units, we had spouses who had lost people. We had the helicopter pilots came down to pose in front of the camera. 2 helicopter pilots who were in the air over New York when the plane struck. Just what we did was we reached out, as stories started to bubble up and unfold after that day, we would reach out and say, we would love it if you would come to the camera. That was the thing. The camera is not movable. It is the studio itself. It's since been disassembled, but as I say, it's the size of a one-car garage. When I'm working it from the outside, there's 2 technicians inside who are maneuvering the various levers and controls of the camera inside. And I'm on radio to them because you cannot focus the camera. You have to focus your subject. So I am shining a bright light on the subject and having the subject move inch by inch, back and forth, until they are in a plane of focus where they're sharp on the Polaroid plane, which is in the back of the camera. And then we'd go lights out in the studio and then flash the system. In that 30-second time prepping the camera, the subject had to stay very, very still. And hence, I think there's a certain quietude that was conferred upon the subjects of this project as they stayed there in the dark and sort of assembled themselves emotionally before the camera recorded them.
We also had another question about what pictures you may have taken with other cameras outside this studio size setup and how you understand them in relationship to the work you did sort of after 9/11.
Well, I never went to the pit, never once. The Polaroid camera was on East 2nd Street off the Bowery. So we were in the neighborhood, I would say that, but I never once went to the pit. Once we started the project, I lived in the studio. There was a loft bed above the camera, and I never strayed further than about 3 blocks or so from the ground zero camera, because we made a vow to everyone, no matter what time you show up, we will photograph you. So we took crews from the pit at 8 o'clock at night, at 3 a.m. in the morning, at 10 o'clock in the morning, all throughout the day. And I would sleep when I could. And then, fire trucks would roll in and say, is this where you're taking the pictures? And the room would fill with firefighters. And I had to turn them around very quickly to get them back on the truck. Or sometimes they would come into the studio and no sooner had they got there, they would get a call and they'd have to leave. So I was basically on call for this camera and for this project for 3 straight weeks.
You had mentioned all of the photographs that you took in the part of the project were completed by about a month after 9/11?
Roughly speaking, about a month, yes.
Wow. And that responded to a question that just came in of how long were you there? Well, you just answered that. That is incredible. And I want to thank you again for, oh, I'm sorry, we had another question come through. Diane asks, did you do any photos of the rescue dogs who work to find people?
Yes, I did. As a matter of fact, I have a couple of other images here. I can just, are you still up and running on the slideshow?
Yes, we are.
So that's Joe Pukowski, who's one of the bomb squad. And then there's a canine. The canine units were incredibly valuable, and canine units came from Boston, from Philadelphia, and the dogs were astonishing in the way they would assist the rescue effort. I mean, the dogs were just historic in the way they contributed.
Well, I'll let one of our viewers sum up. Kim says, thank you for sharing your amazing talent with the world. Thank you for sharing it with us here this afternoon. Thanks to everyone who has been watching. And again, thank you to Joe Mcnally for sharing this project with us.
Well, as I say, it was an honor to do it. So thank you back to all the students, the staff, the dean, for making the opportunity happen.
Thank you all and have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.